So for those who don't know me, I'm Raj, an Agile practitioner and a coach with Lightspeed, a boutique Agile transformation company based out of Herndon, Virginia. So I've been involved with software development for about 20 years, the past 13 of which have been using Agile methods. So I've been introduced to Agile in the early days since 2003. And nothing that I'm sharing here this morning is revolutionary or brand spanking new. The ideas that I'll be sharing with you around stories and patterns for slicing stories have been around for a while, over 10 years now. And the reason for sort of choosing this talk really is that in my line of work as an Agile coach, and with the increased adoption of Agile across the various enterprises, what I'm finding is there's still a lot of Agile teams struggling when it comes to preparing and working with their user stories and really seeing them to getting done. And so that's really the primary reason for why I put forth this talk, and I'm looking forward to sharing these ideas with you. Now, before we really get started, since this is a topic that's probably known to some of you attendees here, I just want to get a quick poll on your experience with slicing stories. Have you done it before? Are you just been exposed to the concepts but haven't practiced it much by yourself or as part of a team or as a coach? Or perhaps it's a concept that's completely new to you. So Stephanie's going to run a quick poll. I just want to get 30 seconds to get a sense of the experience of the folks on the webinar. Okay, so the results are in. Looks like the majority of the participants, over 60%, sort of notionally understand the concept but haven't really practiced it as much. And there's 20%, it's a brand new idea. So this is good. And then there's about 20%, 25% that have done it before. So this is good. It's a broad cross section. And for those, let me just play this again. So this talk hopefully will provide a little bit of information for everybody with various experiences. The broad agenda is pretty straightforward. I want to get started, especially because there is a broad swath that these ideas are completely new to. It's worthwhile for us to think a little bit about what are these user stories? What exactly is it? What does it mean to be thinking about requirements as stories? And then finally, look at the different requirements levels and then get to the core of the topic, which is really around patterns for splitting stories. Why do we do it? What are the patterns? And what are some of the benefits? And then we'll leave some time, probably 10 minutes or so at the end for Q&A. As Stephanie mentioned, I'll also pause at the end of the first section, thinking in stories, and take a few questions before moving on to the next one. Okay? All right, let's get started then. What exactly are stories, right? So user stories have been pretty ubiquitous in the Agile space for a long time. Although we think of it as a Scrum invention, stories actually came to us from another Agile framework, extreme programming, but it's used pervasively regardless of what framework you're using to choose as your Agile methodology, if you will. So in a nutshell, a user story is not a detailed requirement. It was never intended to be one. It's just a brief description that illustrates a user segment's need and what it's supposed to achieve. It's just a one-line description of the intent of a certain requirement, of an expression of a user need. Most often, you will see this user story being expressed in this what is called the Connextra format that was popularized by Mike Cohn, and it reads like this: as a such and such, I want to accomplish something so that I get some benefit, right? So this is the typical format of how a user story is expressed. And the as a portion of it describes the persona or the role, who is going to use this capability or function. The I want to aspect of it is around what is it that I want to do with the system, and why do I want to do it? What larger goal does this really support, right? So the who, the what, and the why are all distilled in this brief expression of a given user's need. The fourth more pertinent question that we'll start to explore when we talk about splitting stories is, how will I know when my story is done, right? This format doesn't really capture that, but that's perhaps an important question that we ought to answer, is how would we know that the story is done? Interestingly, one thing that a user story does not capture, and intentionally so, is the how. How you're going to do it is up to the team, right? So a user story is an expression of a user segment's need from an end user perspective, not the implementation details. Okay. Now, given that basic understanding, I want to sort of also mention, because I've seen lots of teams go to great lengths trying to express every requirement or need in this format. The reality is this is merely meant to be a thinking tool. As long as you can express the who, the what, and the why, it doesn't matter what format you use. So what I'm trying to caution against is when you start to see things like, as a developer I want to do this, or as a system I want to do that, or more generic expressions which say, as a user. What does that really mean? Is a user an end user, an internal user? So on and so forth. It behooves us to think a little deeper as to what we're trying to glean with this brief expression, and not be so caught up with the actual syntax. All right. So to dig a little deeper as to what the user story is supposed to provide for the team, Ron Jeffries, one of the early XP proponents, he suggests that every story has to conform to these 3 C's. The first C is the card. A card is essentially, for those of you who are doing Agile and have these visual boards, you express these stories in these little story cards, and they are constrained by size, and they're intentionally so, because the card is intended to be just a token. It's just a promise of a conversation at the appropriate time with the team, and it's meant to just establish the gist of the intent of that need, but not capture the entire requirement in its entirety, right? So we don't want to expect the written story to transfer all of the requirements to the developer. The conversation is the place where all of the details are going to emerge as to what that story card represents. And the requirement, the conversation is a central part of a story. It's the second C in the 3 C's of a user story. And it's not meant to be a one-way communication. So typically what the anti-pattern that I see in a lot of teams is they see the conversation and the card as being one-way communication channels, and they expect if you're using Scrum as your Agile framework, they expect the product owner or the business stakeholder to spoon feed all of the details of that card in a unidirectional manner. That was never the intent. The conversation ought to be bidirectional, in that the developers and the testers and so forth on the team, the folks who are constructing the piece of software, for example, they need to ask the clarifying questions, and representatives should be there to help answer those questions. And if they don't have the answers, so we'll go and collectively find the information. But it's meant to be a bidirectional conversation. So that's the second C of a user story. Last but not least, the third C in this 3 C's of a user story, and I think a very important piece that most often teams sort of ignore, is the confirmation piece. The confirmation piece is telling us, how will we know that we've accomplished what you wanted to get done in that card, right? For those who are practicing Agile, and it seems like quite a few of you are, the most natural manifestation of this confirmation idea is acceptance criteria. Right, that we keep talking about acceptance criteria as being the boundary that sort of surrounds, it provides the boundary for a story card, and when all the confirmation criteria are met, well, it means that the story is done, right? It's a shared understanding of the boundary of a story card, right? All three perspectives are important for it to be a useful story. So for those especially who are new to the idea of writing stories, another important construct to keep in mind is that of the invest mnemonic. So invest is a mnemonic created by one Mr. Bill Wake, and it stands for, the I stands for independent, N for negotiable, valuable, estimable, small, and testable. So that's the acronym. And Bill Wake suggests that every story that we have should conform to these criteria. Let me briefly go through what each of these really means, and then we'll focus on two specific values for the rest of the conversation. Independent, what does that really mean? What we're really saying is that there should be no inherent dependency on one story to another story. Is it reality that every story is truly isolated from one another? No, that's not how enterprise systems are built. But what we're really suggesting here is that there should not be significant overlap in concept between multiple stories, right? Why is that? Because independent stories give business the ability to schedule and implement them in whatever order they choose. But in all reality, that this is not always possible, but it should be our goal to try to keep them minimally overlapping in concept. So that's what the independent stands for. Negotiable, what we're suggesting here is a story card being negotiable really means that this is not an immutable contract. It's not that is not subject to more discussion and conversation. Until the team is actually getting down to the business of implementing a given story card, things can always change. The boundaries can change. The story cards can be rewritten. It's not meant to be an immutable contract for features. The details will emerge and they'll be captured just in time. Right? So that's what the negotiable aspect in invest means. Valuable essentially is a fundamental construct. We had said a story captures a business use, a customer or end user's need. We are talking about value from that perspective. Value not necessarily for the DBA, the tester and such, but value for whoever is going to be the recipient of this capability that we are building. Okay, the value to the end user. So estimable, before I latch onto the valuable and small, I want to just go through the others. Estimable basically means the team should be able to size that story card. How much effort does it take to complete that story card? We don't need an exact estimate by any stretch of the imagination, but perhaps just enough to help our business or maybe our end user rank and schedule the story's implementation. Yeah. Being estimable is partly a function of a story card being negotiable. It's because it's hard to estimate a story that we don't quite understand, right? So all of these values sort of play off of each other. And also, it also depends on the team's experience. So there's multiple forces at play when we say that every story card should be estimable. But the idea is we should, when I say we, the team doing the work should be able to estimate the amount of work it takes to get that story card done. The next one, small, is also interesting in that what does small mean, right? The definition of small may vary from team to team, but in my experience, to me, small enough means it should be done within a few days of work, right? It's really a small sliver of capability that can be done, coded, developed, tested in a few days. And most new teams that are embracing the Agile idea say, wait a minute, that's impossible. Well, that's where the story splitting patterns sort of come into play, and we'll sort of hold off on that impossible notion until we go through the various patterns. But the idea is we want these to be small enough and granular enough so that they elicit faster feedback. The whole point of agility is responsiveness to change. It's not really about just blind speed. And if you're saying feedback and being responsive to changes is the goal, then we want these stories to be small enough that there's quick turnaround on feedback so that we can use that feedback to pivot or go forth and continue in the same direction or not. Last but not least, the T in INVEST stands for testable. Every story card should be testable. And I see many teams that we have these stories and we then struggle to understand how do we really test this. And the reason perhaps could be how we split these stories is not in a manner that lends itself easy testability. Maybe the business stakeholders says, I have no idea how to test this. So that could be another lens through which you can say, maybe this is not the right way to split this story. So all of these attributes we talked about are valuable for us to keep in mind as we are looking at continuously refining our stories, splitting them, bringing them to the team. Valuable lens through which to sort of look at the value proposition of our stories. Okay. So the patterns that I'm going to talk about, I'm going to try to look at it specifically through the lens of, does it provide value? Is it small enough? And when I talk about small enough, for those who are using Scrum framework, everything is time boxed. Maybe you're doing bi-weekly sprints, 3-week sprints, whatever the cadence may be. Oftentimes, it's tempting to think that a story is small enough, it fits within a sprint. If it fits within a sprint, that's not a bad way to think about it. If you're using Kanban, perhaps you're using measurements such as cycle time to see how long does it take for me to take this from concept to getting it done. Now, either way, whether you're looking at it through the lens of fitting into a sprint or shortening the cycle times, the goal is really not about fitting it into a sprint. The goal should be how small enough so that I can get the feedback faster, right? The fact that it fits into a sprint should be a result, should not be the motivation for trying to make it small. All right. So any questions before we start getting into the 9 or 10 splitting strategies that I'm going to sort of walk us through? Steph, you want to just
yeah, not necessarily a question, but Dominic put in all of these things should lead to improved craftsmanship.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Sure.
Thanks, Dominic, for absolutely. It is about better craftsmanship. Absolutely. Anything else? Any other thoughts, comments? Okay. So moving forward, let's explore some splitting strategies that are valuable and give us these small enough bite-sized chunks that give us fast feedback and give us empirical data to the business, to the end users, and to the team as to whether we're moving in the right direction or not. All right. So before we go to the splitting strategies, I want to just show this visual, which depicts a typical hierarchical breakdown of requirements, if you will. In large enterprises and perhaps even in small places, you're always trying to build some capability. Again, I'm going to look at it through the lens of building software, although these ideas can be applied to non-software assets as well. You typically have a business that has a vision and some business outcomes which translate into some sort of a roadmap, 6-month, yearly, whatever the case may be. And the roadmap is then decomposed into your deliverables and the outcomes that for the business, which then are broken down into capabilities, features, and epics, which are these big chunks, these big boulders. Again, too big to be conformant to those invest criteria we looked at, too big to give us that quick feedback that we're looking for. So then the teams would engage with the business to sort of decompose these large features or epics, the big chunks, the big boulders, into these user stories, which are these smaller chunks that we can finish within our time-bound iterations and so forth. And as you can see, just a user story is not enough. We want these the confirmation criteria, which is what the acceptance criteria is, and we'll explore this idea of testable examples further on in the talk. But this is the level of ongoing refinement that you would typically see in Agile on Agile teams as they're working through to completing their epics and features and so forth. The question really becomes, so we understand that slicing these stories is important because it gives us quick feedback. It gives options for business to say, are we in the right direction or not? And it helps us fail small, if you will. If you're not in the right direction, it's if you don't take these big monumental boulders and just not provide any feedback for 6 months, we're failing big. Whereas if you're doing this in small chunks, perhaps you're failing failing small, which is more recoverable, if you will. So while we understand the benefits of why we want to slice the work, what I see often is teams, especially in the software realm, we have these role specializations. We have the database people, we have the middle tier people, and perhaps we have the front end UI type folks that make up our cross-functional teams. I see a pattern, which really is an anti-pattern, where we identify that this chunk, this slice of the cake, is too big. We know we need to break it down, but the way we break it down is by horizontally breaking the work. What I mean by that is we naturally will sort of fall back to what's our comfort zone. I'm going to say I'm a database person. I'm going to break the story down. In order to create this page, I need to build this entire database model. All right, and they'll split the story that way. And the UI person will say, okay, in order to do this, I am going to break it down by all of the wireframes and the whatever else the UI person does. I'm going to break it by my architectural tier. So this is called horizontal slicing, where you're breaking things down by architectural tiers, because that's our natural comfort zone. But unfortunately, that's not the right pattern. And you see a lot of teams sort of their first foray into slicing stories would be across horizontal tiers. We don't want to do that. But we don't want to do that because it doesn't provide end-to-end value. It's not demonstrable software. So it really fails our value proposition in the invest criteria. It's difficult to test. How would the end user or the business stakeholder really test if you say, this sprint, all we've done is built a bunch of database models? That's not very testable either. And also it makes it hard for the business, because the business is the one who's prioritizing, the product owner is prioritizing these stories. It's hard for them to prioritize when you break it down horizontally across architectural tiers. So first anti-pattern for us to fix when it comes to slicing stories is stories should always be split vertically, which means a thin slice from the user interface, the business logic, as well as the database. So that's really should be our first goal when thinking about slicing, because this fixes all of the problems that we've just mentioned with when you slice things horizontally. Vertical slices help us to provide demonstrable software. It may be not fully featured and feature rich, but it still is a thin sliver that is both testable and demonstrable, which is what we want. And this also allows business to prioritize and shuffle things more easily. And a more subtle benefit to this is it diminishes this idea that I'm a database person, I'm a middle tier person. It breaks this silo mentality by when you start to have to break these in a vertical fashion, because you have to collaborate to make this end-to-end realization happen, these vertical slices. All right, so all of these patterns I'm going to talk about are going to be vertical slices, and they're going to try to conform to those invest criteria we looked at earlier. First and foremost, and I'm going to do this through some examples. So when I do this session in with face-to-face conversation, I can engage the audience. So in, here, being a webinar, I'm going to try to sort of be the one driving all of the conversation. But the first pattern that I'm going to introduce you to is the idea of splitting by workflow steps. Now, this pattern is useful when your initial story is describing some sort of a workflow, right? Most of our projects and products are about some sort of a workflow that we're enabling for our business. So in this example, let's say we are building this e-learning platform, and my story says, as a learner, I want to register for a class and pay for it using a credit card so that I'm better informed about Agile. Right? So sounds like it conforms to our Connextra format as I want to do this so that I'm better informed about Agile. Right? Now, the question is, this is an entire workflow. Being able to register, look for a class, pay for it. It's an entire workflow end to end. The question is, can all of this be done? Is it small enough? Perhaps not, right? Maybe this is an epic size. So the questions for us to think about when we think about splitting this is, can we take a thin slice from the entire workflow is one question we can ask ourselves. And the other one could be, can we do the initial step and the last step first and then do the intermediary steps? So this is something for us to think about when we see a story such as this. So in this example, perhaps the way we can split this is, as a learner, I can view classes. As a customer, I can select the course, or as a learner, I can select the course. As a learner, I can review my registration. As a learner, I can submit my registration. So these are the natural workflow steps, and now it's for us to collaboratively, business and the team, to see what makes most sense. Do we want to do the view and the submit because these are the beginning and the end pieces? Is there some easy way for us to accomplish this, and we'll add in all of the details later? Or is it more useful for us to just provide the ability to just view the courses? Maybe that's good enough, and maybe they can just call somebody to register for the class. Perfectly viable, minimum viable product, if you will, right? You're getting to see if even the capability to pay by credit card and all of that is necessary. Maybe it's not necessary for the first month or two, right? So this is an example of splitting work by workflow steps. As you can see, this is still a vertical sliver that the end user can engage with. This gives options to business to say, which ones should I do first, which ones can I defer for another time, and also which ones are really necessary at all, right? So these gives options to business. So that's our first obvious split pattern. The second one is splitting by operations. So usually when you start to see a story that looks like this, as a training provider, I want to manage my course offerings so that learners can view them, right? So, okay, sounds reasonable enough. To me, when I see stories like this, I'm going to latch on to words like manage, configure, administer. Those sorts of words indicate to me that there's multiple operations that are implicit and not explicit when you start to use words such as this. So right off the bat, I know that implicitly there's multiple operations when you're talking about things like manage, administer, configure, so on and so forth. So the question then is, can we split the various implicit operations into separate stories? So in this case, it could be, as a training provider, maybe I can upload my course catalog is one operation, edit the course catalog is one, adding a course is one operation, deleting a course. So the basic CRUD operations, create, read, update, delete, these are all implicit when we start to use the words such as manage, right? So perhaps we can start splitting our stories along these operational lines and schedule them as you see fit, okay? So again, both of those patterns are pretty obvious patterns. The third one is an obvious pattern, but I see far too often many teams just don't take the time to break down the different roles that are interacting with a certain capability or functionality. So in this example, let's take this example further. As a learner, I want to register for a course so that I can accomplish something, right? So it seems pretty obvious on the surface, but if you dig a little deeper, perhaps there's multiple roles that could be impacted by such a capability. So for example, Lightspeed is a learning organization. I took some of these examples from what we do. So we offer training classes and so forth. Yes, we have a site through which learners can register for courses. But oftentimes we also have our training coordinators who are registering folks for the class on their behalf. We do that all the time. But if you look under the covers, on the surface, it may seem like it's the same logical operation, registering somebody for a course. But underneath the scenes, there are slight nuances and differences between how an end user would register versus how the training coordinator might register somebody for a class. So taking those different roles, if you will, or personas, can help us sort of decompose the work, because there are nuances that we can sort of split the stories along. So in this case, it could be just these two different roles: the learner, the training coordinator who's trying to help the learner register for a class. So when I start to see stories such as a user, and I see this so many times, and perhaps you've seen that within your own organizations, that's too generic. What does that mean? What does user mean? Is it an end user? Is it an internal user? Is it an administrator? It behooves us to dig a little deeper, because that gives us an opportunity to break up that story card into multiple stories. So another splitting strategy might be data boundaries. So this is useful when our initial story card is doing something to different aspects of data, right? In this example, as a learner, I want to view course information so that yada yada yada. So the data boundaries that I can see naturally coming out of this perhaps could be the course information. That is an entity that has multiple data facets to it. It could be the name and description of the course. It could be the agenda, the outline for the course. And it could be more nuanced things such as the course instructor qualifications, the address of the location where the course is being held, so on and so forth. As you start to look at this, it should be, it gives, what you're trying to do is break it up in such a manner so that you can get quick turnaround, quick feedback, and also give options to business. Say, yeah, I don't think the course agenda is the instructor qualifications is necessary just yet. We haven't even proved if this idea of a e-learning platform is even a viable product to begin with. So no need to bake in all of these bells and whistles just yet, right? So that's our job as a team collectively with business, is to give all of us options to get feedback quickly, and story splitting strategies are a way to enable that. Okay, so moving on. So if we'll look at a few more nuanced splitting strategies. So this strategy called simple first and enhance could be useful when the initial story has some core basic functionality that provides most of the business value that you're seeking, right? So let's take a look at this example. As a learner, I want to see my past courses so that for whatever reason, some business outcome that the learner is looking for. So on the surface, it looks like it's pretty straightforward request for a story, but the majority of the basic functionality may be realized by just showing the learner all of the past courses. The 80%, I mean, if you go back to what they call the 80-20 rule, that the majority of capabilities value is realized with 20% of the work, right? Maybe seeing all of my past courses is good enough. It provides the meat of the capability that I'm looking for. And then we can add the bells and whistles such as, oh, show me only the courses completed on a given topic. Show me only the courses that I've completed in the past 2 months. Or maybe it could be more sophisticated search capabilities where you're filtering on multiple facets. But again, all of that is secondary to the core business value of just showing my historical data to the learner. Right? So again, provides opportunities for splitting along those lines. Yeah, here's another example of splitting strategy that's pretty popular, which is called splitting by major effort. This is useful when there's significant energy and time that needs to be spent on developing the capability for the first story. Even if you've applied all of the various splitting strategies, you still feel like there's some significant amount of work to be done for the first story, and then after that, the subsequent stories become smaller and smaller. So be it, right? So in this example, as a learner, I want to pay for my class with Visa, Amex, MasterCard, so on and so forth, right? So if you look at this, the team will right away, especially the development type, will tell you right away, if you don't have a payment gateway already established within your system, the biggest chunk of work is going to be trying to do that first step, be it Visa, American Express, or MasterCard. It doesn't matter. The bulk of the work, heavy lifting, is at getting that payment gateway established. So perhaps you could break this into two chunks, right? Pay with one credit card. Which type? Maybe doesn't matter. And then once you have that done, perhaps you can complete all the other payment channels consolidated into one card, right? That could be a splitting strategy. Right? 0-1 many. So this strategy is useful when, and I think most of our systems, we are interacting with one or more instances of some entity, something. So in this example, as an online shopper, I want to delete items from my shopping cart so I don't want to pay for things I don't need. Let's say that's our story. So if you apply the 0-1 many principle, splitting strategy, deleting one item at a time is easier than trying to delete a whole collection of things from my shopping cart. From an implementation perspective, oftentimes doing nothing, of course, doing zero is the most ideal case, but doing one thing is easier than doing a collection of things. So you start with interacting with the one item at a time, and then move on to do a collection of things. So that's another splitting strategy that you could apply for a lot of these stories when you're dealing with multiple entities. And oftentimes you will also start to see that maybe deleting one thing at a time is good enough for several months. You don't have to deal with collections of things. Maybe it's not needed at all. But that's for the business to prioritize, not for the development and the testers to sort of say, yes, it's actually needed. The prerogative should be businesses. But our job is to give them the options. All right, last but not least, I want to share this splitting strategy, the rules and examples. Every story, more often than not, will have some sort of a business rule that it exemplifies. So as a developer and a tester, what I really want to know is, give me what are the rules that sort of that exemplify this, illustrate the story, and then perhaps you can also give us some examples. If we're asking the business, maybe we're asking the testers, somebody collectively, we want to know what the rules are. And to this end, I've used this strategy quite successfully in multiple organizations, is that of example mapping. So example mapping essentially is a simple technique where you just put the story on the board and then just start asking these questions. What's the business rule? What's the business rule here? Is this rule different from the other rule? Can you give me an example of a rule? And also you're noting down any unanswered questions. You're also noting down any assumptions. So collectively what you're really doing is forming the acceptance criteria with the rules, and the acceptance scenarios are examples that illustrate and exemplify a given rule. Now, this also provides us a seam along which you can start to break stories. Okay, it's a powerful way for us to not only gain a shared understanding of the story itself through these rules, but also if you dig a little deeper, we can also get these clarifying examples which can become our acceptance scenarios, and perhaps that can drive our test automation strategy, because these acceptance scenarios can then become automated tests. But from a splitting strategy, once you lay out these rules, it can give us natural seams through which you can start to break up that story. Okay. Well, last but not least, if none of these strategies work, that's when you start to break out a spike, right? A spike, essentially, for those who are familiar with the term, is essentially the team is saying, I have no idea how to really break this down, how to estimate it, because there's a lot of uncertainty because of lack of knowledge of a particular domain, or uncertainty because of the complexity, or just the sheer size of things. So a spike could be used, you time box it to a few days or whatever the case may be, where you're just investigating the story a little bit more, so that you can now make it more estimable, small enough, and so forth. Right, so it's the spike is a way to identify and surface key uncertainties. But regardless, a spike is time boxed like everything else in Agile, and just like you demonstrate a completed story, a spike also should result in some shared learning by the team that you share with business and the team. As I had mentioned, so in everything that I've mentioned here is not new. All of these patterns have been around a long time, and these are not the only patterns. This slide that I'm showing here, I really love this, and I take it to the teams all the time. It's put forth by Richard Lawrence, and you can find this. Just say search for how to spread a story, Richard Lawrence, and you'll find this nice cheat sheet, if you will, that sort of nicely summarizes all of the things we've talked about, and it also talks about a few other patterns. And at the end, in the resources section of the talk, I've also included a whole bunch of other resources that you can sort of lean on that will give you more detailed strategies beyond what we've discussed here in the webinar. But this cheat sheet is a good one to bring to the table with the teams when you're grooming your requirements and you're trying to split stories. The question, as we sort of come to the tail end of the conversation here, is who's doing all of this grooming? Who are the players playing in this refinement process? And these days, this idea of the three amigos has become pretty ubiquitous in the Agile space. The three amigos are your business representatives, your development representatives, the programmers, and your test representatives coming together with the product owner, and then trying to break these features and capabilities into these user stories with this unambiguous shared understanding of the story boundaries, and making sure there's a value proposition that each of these stories provides from an end user perspective, and that they're small enough so where we can learn fast and they still fit within our sprint boundaries and so forth. So again, and you typically are going to do this as part of your ongoing refinement process, but you are collaboratively doing this. It's not the job of any one person. It's not the job of just the business to spoon feed these details to the team. It's a collective endeavor. So I would like to sort of close out the talk and then take some questions by looking at this this notion of zone of control and sphere of influence. So what makes for a good story, right? So good stories typically need to fall into. Now, before I get there, let me just explain what I mean by zone of control and sphere of influence. So zone of control is a systems thinking idea that we're going to apply to stories. So zone of control is everything that we can change and something that's within our control, right? Creating a database table, that's fully within the development team's control. So that's an example of zone of control. A sphere of influence are things that we can impact tangentially, but we are not in full control of, right? For example, from a development team's perspective, a programmer's perspective, yes, I know how to do the coding, I know how to build this page. Now, whether it drives the right kind of business outcome is not fully within my control, right? I'm influencing it, but I'm not fully within. It's not fully within my control. So, and then there's finally this idea of an external environment. So there may be things that we can't influence or even control. So we'll look at what that does to our stories. So looking at this lens of zone of control and sphere of influence, good stories are those where they are within the control of, in terms of the implementation, the deliverable is within the control of the teams, but the user need, the business outcome is something that we can influence from a team perspective. That's an example of a good story, right? A bad story, and you see quite a few of these on teams, is stories that are fully within the control of the development team and also fully in control, even the business outcome, so to speak, is fully in control of the development team. So an example of a misleading or a fake story to me that would be, as a database person, I need to build a database table so that a table exists. So that's fully within my control and influence. So that is not a good, worthwhile story, right? So good stories, the development aspects, the deliverables are within the control of the development team, but they're only influencing the business outcome. That usually is an indication of a good story. Now, if you start to have stories where the development team has no influence, they're not in direct control of the deliverable, and if the business stakeholders or product owners are not in control or can influence the business outcome, then you have a problematic story, right? You see this a lot, where there's lots of cross-team dependencies, and you start to see stories slipping because they're not in control of their own destiny, especially from a team perspective. So again, I'm not saying this is the only way through which you can sort of gauge the effectiveness of your stories, but it can be a powerful way to quickly assess whether you have stories that are good stories, or stories that are not actionable, or stories that are fraught with the risk of slippage, or things that are completely unrealistic. It's a good lens through which to look at stories. So as a wind down our conversation and take questions, if you are in the Scrum model, of course you have your iterations or your sprints, and there's only two stable states, right? The stable states are when the team is about to get into the sprint to do the work, and once you exit the sprint, once you've completed your the committed set of work that the team is committed to doing in that sprint. So using stories and story splitting strategies could be a powerful way for us to make sure that we are collectively framing stories in such a manner that they are truly ready for consumption. Too often I see organizations where we're going agile, we're going to start sprinting, without a deliberate a grooming exercise where you're looking at these stories collectively, understanding the scope, breaking them down, making sure they're valuable, and so forth. And I feel like too often we forget the softer side of Agile, if you will, and focus too much on the mechanics of it. And I feel like story splitting falls into that bucket, where we are not taking the time to truly understand and break down stories reasonably before we start embarking on the implementation details. To summarize quickly what we've talked about, as you go back to your teams, think about preparing stories with invest, the mnemonic we talked about, in mind. Having the conversations collectively across the different roles trumps capturing it in some tool. Small stories help us discover what really needs to be built. And again, I'm going to reiterate what I said earlier. Fitting stories into your time box is not the goal. It should just become a consequence of the fact that you're trying to build these valuable little slivers so that you want quick feedback. It's really learning and discovery is what splitting is all about. It's not about trying to jam it into a sprint. And we've explored about 10 strategies here. And as I mentioned, these are not the only strategies. There are lots of other strategies, and the resources section will help you, if you're interested, to sort of explore those further. Last but not least, we want teams to be very diligent about creating a shared understanding of the boundaries of a story through these rules and examples. And we sort of introduce this idea of example mapping, which is a very simple, lightweight technique for us to drive that shared understanding through these rules and examples. All right, so questions.